Sarah Ferguson is currently starting to see the rug being pulled from under her feet, it looks like. News of this has been shared by a well-placed insider who recently spoke to Radar Online. According to their findings, the ex-couple who still chooses to cohabitate are basically strangers now. Because while Andrew spends his time shut away, pacing and mumbling to himself, Sarah had always been good at disguises. Not with couture, not with hats or pearls, but with the gentler masks life requires. Warmth over a cool day, composure over panic. She wore them with a practiced flick of the wrist, a laugh that arrived at the right second, a hand that squeezed in sympathy. But masks slip. Even the most delicate veils tear when the wind changes. On a damp November morning, the sort that seemed to watch you with a polite but curious indifference, Sarah stood at the tall sash window of Royal Lodge and watched the driveway. Gray sky bled into a wet hedgerow. Small drips traced the stone. She had been there, in one form or another, long enough to know the sound of someone approaching. The patient crunch of gravel, the faint echo of a footfall against brick. It used to be enough to soothe her. Now it set her teeth on edge. "Are you coming to the study for tea?" Andrew asked from the doorway behind her, voice thin with the tremor of someone who had been pacing for too long and learned to measure the world in circles. She turned, and the face she saw was not the jaunty smile photographs had trained the public to accept. Age had not been especially kind of late. There were hollows beneath his eyes and a small stubborn bruise at his jaw that had persisted for days. He blamed it on clumsiness, but he spent hours at odd moments staring at his hands as if they were foreign objects. "I'll be there," Sarah said. She tried to keep the warmth in her voice equal for both of them. She told herself this was an ordinary day, but the house felt like a stage set that had been left to dampen. Props in place, actors off stage. Something else was moving in the wings. She felt the scrape of it at the edges of her awareness, like a moth too close to a lamp. They were officially divorced. Practically, they had kept the choreography of marriage for reasons that belonged to history and convenience. Royal Lodge had been Andrew's home, then a joint retreat, then a placeholder. People interpreted cohabitation in curious ways. Compassion, curiosity, the spectral hope that two people might still find each other in the old rooms. But grief has a way of freezing motion. They'd been hollowed by years of public life, by betrayals and reconciliations, by the unrelenting machinery of viewership and gossip. The insiders had long ago described them as two islands connected by a pier that only existed on paper. It would have been a fair enough image, only the pier had begun to rot. The rumor first arrived as a whisper at the staff quarters. Shadowy figures, strange cars late at night, a man who watched from behind a hedge sometimes, then sometimes left flowers that did not fit anyone's taste. It was the sort of gossip that, in a small household, ate at you until it had teeth. At first, the staff joked, a secret admirer," and then they stopped laughing. A Sainsbury's van once turned down the lane at 3 a.m. and then drove past again, as if deciding whether to commit the theft of a lifetime. An unfamiliar voice occasionally spoke through the intercom, pausing so long that Io, the head housekeeper, swore she could hear it searching. The tabloids described it differently each morning. The tabloids loved a good villain. Shadowy figures, sinister plots, hearsay fed into a press organ that digested it into something louder and more solid. Sarah read some of it and burned the rest. She wanted to believe it was the work of bored journalists trying to keep a story alive, but reality, she was beginning to learn, was sometimes more persistent than narrative. Andrew's behavior confirmed nothing and everything. He locked doors and opened them, left the curtains half drawn, and then flung them back with a suddenness that frightened the cat. He had the new habit of leaving notes in strange places. Inked scraps for the gardener, lists for the chef, arrows for the maid. They were functional, sometimes absurd. Milk, bread, not the man in the hat, followed by a small doodle of a hat with a cross through it. He grinned when she caught sight of them, embarrassed, as if admitting to a private joke and then retreating. "It could be nothing," she said one afternoon, sitting with a cup of tea that turned cold too quickly. They were in the library, surrounded by volumes bound in guilt and memory. The room smelled like dust and lemon oil. Andrew's fingers worried a sleeve. And people who have something to hide might create shadows. He didn't finish the sentence. He rarely finished sentences now. He had a habit of dropping thoughts like seeds, without the patience to tend them. Sarah watched him struggle with the words he could not articulate, anxieties planted across years and watered with silence. Outside, the cameras, always the cameras, licked at the brick. They were less obvious than the tabloids, a tripod placed where the lane curved, a lens blinked like an eye. Once, a drone had hovered just beyond the trees, indifferent to its own audacity. That drone had a camera that was smaller and therefore more accurate, more intrusive. It could spy on a person's habits, cataloging their comings and goings until the list of movements became a novel about them. Sarah wrapped a shawl around her shoulders when she knew it was out there. Sometimes the act made her feel ridiculous, a child pretending her blanket was armor. Other nights, she would stand on the lawn in slippers and whisper into the night to no one in particular, as if the air itself could take offense at being watched. It began with notes. At first, they were anonymous letters slipped below the letterbox, folds of paper pressed with a thumb. The first contained one sentence, "We see you." The second, a blacked-out paragraph in which vowels had been removed, so that the words stumbled like a man with no map. It practically hissed. Leave? Leave? Love? The handwriting was a mix of neat capitals and a furious scrawl. It was, at best, intimidating. At worst, it was a sign that someone had chosen them as their theater. Sarah did not want to tell the staff. Iowa was growing old, and the staff were people who had their own lives to worry about. There was something obscene about wringing the throats of their habitual dignity with fear. Besides, there was a greater horror. What if she told someone and the shadowy figures reacted? What if the whisper became wind and that wind knocked more than flowers from the front steps? She called an old friend, a man who had made a precarious career out of being a fixer. He arrived one afternoon with a tin of biscuits and a list of questions. He knew, in shorthand, how public life wore people down. He had seen how the press could magnify a private hurt into a public torment, and how sometimes threats were nothing more than the echo of a bored imagination given microphones. He listened and smiled the way a man smiles when he is cataloging rather than comforting. He asked, "Have you two done anything recent?" But Sarah's hands were clean of scandal. They had a life left of routine in the odd charity gala. The story, if it could be called that, was stale. "Someone is watching," she said. "Someone is trying to make us feel unsafe. So, make them sorry," he replied, without malice. "You want the truth, Sarah. Sometimes stopping attention is simply a matter of refusing to feed it. You could move, you could play dead, or you could look at it and say you are not afraid." She wanted to believe it was that simple. She wanted to believe a single, decisive action would sweep away the inconvenience of fear. Instead, fear became an ingredient in the house. It seasoned their meals, rounded the edges of conversation. At night, Andrew would sit in the conservatory and watch the dark with the appetite of a man trying to find a solution in the stars. Sarah would write lists of practicalities and then set them on fire, refusing to give the dark any more power than it already had. There were moments of farce. A man in the village who fancied himself brave decided to defend the family honor. He approached the gate one evening with a phone number and 2 cans of something that might have been a weapon. He was politely rebuffed by security, who were efficient in a way that made Sarah both reassured and resentful. The tabloids called him a white knight. The tabloids invented a romance. The villagers pretended to be having other ideas entirely. But fear, when patient, grows teeth. The first real violence was subtle. A rear car tire was deflated on a rainy Thursday. The note pinned to the wheel read, "Stay." The engine would start one minute and refuse the next. Someone slipped into the garden at dawn and placed a wreath of wilted flowers near the greenhouse with a card that said, "Nothing lasts." There were phone calls with long pauses, then the sound of breathing that did not belong to a human mouth. It was not the sort of violence that bruised flesh. It was the sort that wears you down until you are so exhausted you forget what state is normal and which is survival. And then Andrew began to dream at odd moments and wake with pieces of sentences on his tongue he could not place. He called Sarah at 3 a.m. one night and said, "I dreamed of a man with a book. He had my face in his hands like a fruit." She walked the dark house until the dawn came and the sky promised forgiveness. She held him then, as she had not in years. There are reasons the body remembers what the brain cannot, and she felt his ribs move like a frightened bird. He told her he feared he had made enemies out of people he had not even met, that there were debts unpaid in corners of the world where he had been naive. The household installed security cameras that fed into a screen in the study. The images looked like ghosts, small, grainy, often incomprehensible. There was a figure on one feed who lingered at the edge of a hedge with the patience of a surgeon. There were once 2 figures at midnight, reflected in the pain like a bad memory of someone else. The footage showed them speaking, their hands animated. They were small, anonymous things with no name, yet they had names in the newspapers: stalkers, vultures, obsessives. They had legal names too, but those were not the names of shadows. Sarah hired a young private investigator, one who preferred to keep his face anonymous and his business cards unadorned. He smelled faintly of aftershave and old bookstores. He was the sort who listened more than he spoke, who understood that fear often announces itself in the tiny things people do to survive. He discovered something in the downloads of a phone: snatches of a conversation, a location pinged near a motorway, a name that was not a name. He found receipts for flowers in a town 2 hours away. He found a photograph of the house taken from the same angle as the drone. He showed Sarah the picture and did not need to say more. The photograph, he intimated, made the watchers deliberate. "Why us?" she asked the investigator once, staring at a map that resembled a web of ordinary highways and lines like a spider's net. He shrugged. "Sometimes you're chosen because you're in the right place at the wrong time. Or you're chosen because your life is public and therefore profitable. People who are bored or angry or both like to have a target. The more famous you are, the more profitable the target." Profit. The word made her stomach cold. She thought of children online, their thumbs flicking across screens that turned privacy into an exchange. She thought of men with money, and men who thought they were artists, and men who thought they were righting wrongs. All of them were merchants of attention. At brunch, Andrew sat with a paper and his collar open, as if the paper could be a veil. He read, and aside from the typical headlines that claimed to know everything, he found a paragraph about an eviction notice. The house was quietly and unexpectedly under legal pressure. Royal Lodge, a name that felt like a ghost with a title, had inched toward a legal precipice. The landlord had other ideas. Land that was once secure was now a negotiation. They had been told, politely, to vacate within months. Sarah felt the rug pulled from under her, not in the figurative sense of panic, but quite literally. The room shifted. The house, which had always been place and pillow, now became a stage with a curtain that could be drawn on them at any moment. The threat from the outside narrowed into a practical problem. If they had to leave, where would they go? Who would they trust? Who would tell the story that had been written by 100 different hands? Move, the tabloids suggested. Move abroad, move far. Move to the south of France and scrub the slate clean. Another line simply said, fight. The world offers both spectacle and choice, and they had to decide which to accept. But the reality was narrower. They had to pack a life. Packing is a measure of time. It imposes deadlines and creates arguments over which vase to save and which photograph to toss. Packing forced them to look at the material clutter that had become their history. Sarah started to collect small things into boxes, someone else's life, packed away. She found a letter tied with a ribbon in a drawer of Andrew's desk. It was not his handwriting. The envelope was thickened with age. She opened it as if opening a wound.